In the days and weeks to come, you're going to hear a lot said about grit. You're going to hear a lot said about what it means to persevere, to be focused, to be committed to something so that you can triumph and so that you can overcome even adversity. You're going to hear a lot about that because we're going in Canada to be celebrating the win that happened by Bianca Andreescu of the U.S. Open. How many of you had the televisions tuned in yesterday and watched the greatest thing since the Raptors? Yes. For those of you who are Toronto Maple Leaf fans, just let me take this moment to give you encouragement, yes, a dirge, that this may be, I don't know, but you got to see, if you didn't see the tennis match against Serena Williams, what you missed seeing was this, not only a great display of power and strength, a display of endurance with each swing and contact of the racket with the ball, grunts and you got to see playing through adversity. You got to see playing against the psychological odds stacked against you as the visitor to a home crowd celebrating your opponent. You got to see grit by Bianca. Yves Boulay, who's the director at the Ontario Racquet Club where Bianca used to play, was already in interviews talking about that grit. She has shown grit and being able to maintain composure. So with each interview you hear, you're going to be bombarded, I should say, with this discussion about that focus, that grit. So what is the source of Bianca's perseverance and her grit? What is it that we're going to hear? And I'm always interested in what it is that makes people tick. What we know is that Bianca practices meditation each day. She knows how to zone in, to turn off all of the distractions of the world around her. We know that she says she's, influenced by the techniques of people like Tony Robbins. If you've been up late one night and watched infomercials, or your Facebook feed has been overwhelmed by Tony Robbins telling you about how you too can be a peak performer. Well, Bianca has drawn on those skills to be focused. Now here's the thing. We're not going to be great tennis players. We're not elite athletes. And so we may not necessarily need to have that kind of focus in our lives, the kind of focus that elite athletes must have so that they can find their flow. They can be in the zone. But we still need to figure out how it is that we can have grit in our lives, how it is that we can persevere. After she won, Bianca made this sign of the cross and then looked up, and if I recall, there was this kiss that she gave. And so I don't know what her beliefs are. We know that she was born in Canada, her parents from Romania, and that when she was younger, she moved back to Romania for a couple years. She's fluent in the language, and so most likely there's Catholicism or maybe an Orthodoxy in there. And it's a great reminder that even though we may hear in the sports interviews to come about all of her individual focus, that is built upon a scaffold of relationships. That's built upon community, family. That she has found that strength because she has parents who love her, who have given up their own time and their own money so that she can succeed. Teammates who she credits with helping her to succeed, and coaches being there. We may not be elite athletes, but we know what it means to have a community that can hold us up. Now here's the thing. If you were to ask Bianca what she thinks about today's scripture passage, particularly the line about hating father and mother, I think she'd have the same kind of reaction that we have. I think that there'd be the same kind of pushback against this that we have. What is Jesus talking about when he says to us and people who have benefited from the sacrifices of their parents, that you can't follow me unless you hate father and mother? We'll get to that in a moment. Before we do, I want to talk about how it is that we find security in our lives. Security that father, mother, parents, grandparents, that Bianca's grandmothers provided to her as they tended to her back in Romania. What are the things that keep us safe and secure? Well, let's say there's 3 security systems that we have. There's one that is the relationships that we have, the bonds that we have, like father and mother, and they protect us against things like rejection. There is reputation that we have with our peers, and that protects us against ridicule, because who wants to be ridiculed in the eyes of our friends? And then there's this ability to be reasonable with risk, rather than being reckless and rash. We have these 3 ways of protecting ourselves. Let's just look briefly at each of them. Our relationship bonds have a lot to do with love, and they have a lot to do with hate. Love and hate are 2 of the most powerful words that we can play with in our lives. We can hear a young grandchild walk up to us and say, "I love you." And even though we know they don't fully understand what it means, we know that it's beautiful and it can lift us up. Or we can have a teenage child come to us in the midst of all of the stresses and uncertainties of adolescence and shout out at us as parents, "I hate you." And it can unravel us. It can rip our heart right out of our chest. But these words, like love isn't always good and hate isn't always bad. Love can hurt. Hate can make us feel secure. To have a wife come to you and say, "I've fallen in love with another man," where love suddenly becomes the pain of abandonment. Or to have a parent say to you, "I hate that person who bullied you. I want to take it to them," can be uplifting to know that you're supported, that there's someone there who has your back. Love and hate are powerful things. And Jesus is playing with these words. He's throwing these words like a stick of dynamite into the crowd who's been taught something from birth, something from the 10 Commandments, the same thing you've been taught from birth from the 10 Commandments. What is the commandment? Thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother. Andy's parents are proud. Andy knew it. You know it. Thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother. Yet Jesus is saying, this, that you should hate. Here's the thing, and this is where I get to this idea of an impossible ask. Jesus knows that there are some decisions that you can't have it both ways. You got to pick between one or the other. And when it comes to the 10 Commandments, not only is there commandment to honor thy father and thy mother, there's also this commandment: thou shalt have no other gods before me. And if it ever had to come down to it, when push had to come to shove, and we had to choose between God or family, what Jesus is saying is, choose God. It may seem like it's impossible, but I can make it possible. If you just choose God and know that that's the only thing you can't waver on, everything else will fall into place. And so Jesus says, whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. You need to get what's going on here. Jesus is asking the disciples something he knows they cannot accomplish. It's not that he's trying to make them fail, but he's wanting to wake them up to a reality. We know that the disciples had fathers and mothers that they loved. We know that they had brothers and sisters. 2 of the disciples were brothers. And we know that they loved those. And so they couldn't quite do this. But in the end, they were still disciples. The second security system that we have is reputation. Protected from the scorn of our community. All who see it will begin to ridicule him, is what Jesus says with this parable of someone who builds a tower, lays the foundation, starts the job but doesn't finish it, and how is subject to the ridicule of the whole community. We can lose the esteem of those who are around us. The other day, I was watching David Letterman's new Netflix show. You'll recall David Letterman, he had that TV show, and now he has a new show with a new beard that he wears, and his guest was the ever-loved Ellen DeGeneres. How many people love Ellen DeGeneres? Isn't she just great? David Letterman loves Ellen DeGeneres. And as they talked about Ellen's life, they're going back to that moment over 20 years ago, when Ellen did something very risky, and she came out as being, was it Lebanese? Yes, that was her stick. She came out as lesbian. And in the course of 1 year, she lost everything. A popular sitcom where I think it was 42 million people watched the episode where she came out, to no one calling her sitcom being canceled, to having no work, and for a few years just sort of crawling up into a corner. No matter how safe we think we are, whether it's by esteem or money, we can lose it all in a heartbeat. Our reputation can be ripped from us for lesser things than telling the world who we really are. And Jesus is saying, you know what? Don't let that concern about reputation get in the way of you following me as a disciple. All who see it will begin to ridicule him. All who see our vulnerability, maybe they'll ridicule us. And when's the last time you had someone look at you sideways? You had someone take a step back from you just because they didn't like what you had to say or what it is that you believed. It's a scary place to be rejected. Here's the third part, reasonable risk. To be vulnerable. What's it mean to be vulnerable? In today's world, it's kind of sad. Vulnerability has to do with our investments, our money, has to do with our cyber protection, our our computers. But vulnerability is about something that goes on inside of us. And maybe we put up all of these other walls. The economy is vulnerable right now. Your computer is vulnerable right now. Your investments are vulnerable right now. So that we can protect our hearts from being vulnerable. If you have read anything by Brené Brown, you know what she thinks about vulnerability. That it's a pathway to being creative. She says, courage is born of vulnerability. What's that mean? It means that when we're safe, we don't have to dig down and find that grit. It's great to be safe, but if we don't challenge ourselves, we're never going to grow. Creativity comes right on that edge. Do we get to a certain age? Do we get to a certain point in life where we have enough money in the bank? Our computer software is secure. We're protected against the economy, that we don't have to be vulnerable anymore? And if that's the case, how do we be creative as followers of Jesus? In the parable that Jesus gives, he says that king who realizes that he's outnumbered by army is going to go and approach the opposing king and ask for terms of peace. Is that what we do too soon, rather than assume a risk? So we want to make sure that things are at peace. Is that what we do as a congregation? Is that what we do as a community Strathroy? Just don't rock the boat. Please, just don't rock the boat. And so we have the impossible ask by Jesus, asking all of these things of his disciples that they cannot deliver on. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Like whoever's not really willing to lose everything, their reputation, their security, they can't be my disciple. Keep this in mind. Jesus is saying this to his disciples before he carries his cross. We know how the story ends. We know that none of the disciples picked up their cross and followed him to his own crucifixion. And yet we know they remain not only disciples, but apostles who became the church. Jesus makes the impossible ask to remind us that no matter how hard we try, we're going to fall down. We're going to stumble. We're going to come up short. We're going to disappoint one another. I am going to disappoint you. I promise you that. We're going to stumble, but our works aren't what get us saved. God's grace steps in where we fall short and saves us. God's grace covers over our shortcomings, and God's grace makes it possible for us to be creative, to be faithful followers, and to switch our focus from worrying about protecting ourselves to taking risks in this world, in this community, with each other, looking each other in the eyes and measuring whether or not each other's okay. Looking into each other's eyes and letting others know that we can be vulnerable too and that we need the care of one another. As a congregation, a Strathroy United Church, we can find ways to avoid being vulnerable. We can find ways not to take risks. Or we can dig in and know that we have a grit because we know what it means to lose members. We know what it means to struggle financially. We know that things aren't going to come easy for us. But you know what? That's going to be our strength. Because it means that we can look people in the eyes in this community and we can be vulnerable rather than high and mighty. We're not going to connect to people from that high place. We're going to connect with this community out of vulnerability and out of our own witness that God comes to us in Jesus Christ in that vulnerability and saves us. At the end of the tennis match, you recall when they were interviewing both Serena and Bianca. When Serena was being interviewed, the ESPN reporter, asked her about her opponent. And Serena gave just the greatest compliment to Bianca, saying that, other than herself or her sister, she's happy that it was Bianca that won. To know that even though this was her opponent, she was cheering for her success. We may think that God is our opponent, that God is fighting back with us with each swing that we attempt. But that's just God making sure that we're in the game and stretching us. That all along, God is happy that we win and that we are saved. Thanks be to God for that. Amen.